I just have a question. I'm wondering, why do you use the term ripcord? What are you referring to? I know what that is with a parachute, but is it a place? Is it a campaign
yeah,
or what?
it's the name of the fire support base that they set up. So they had to name it something, and so it's Airborne Division, so ripcord, as in ripcord on a parachute.
Yeah,
You had to have a code name, so
and that was,
that's what they came up with.
Okay.
Maybe they ran out of places where the 101st had fought in World War II.
Exactly.
Yeah, they had. So they had.
So many battles in World War II.
And I'll address that too. If you look over here, here's the top two provinces I was talking about. Ripcord's right here in the center. Everybody's heard of Hamburger Hill. You're talking about 5 kilometers due south of Ripcord. Here's the DMZ. DMZ was about 30 to 35 miles wide at this point. Camp Evans is over here. This is where the 101st was based. The Marines were actually at Camp Evans before they left. 101st took it over at this point in time. But if you look at the names, and feel free to come over and look, veterans, we have some things here that you can take with you, divisions that were active and where they were in Vietnam. But this whole area up here has Marine names. Quezon, Razorback Ridge, all Marine names. And then you get further south and you see all the 101st names, Bastogne, Rakasson, Normandy. So they named, as Mr. Whipple alluded to earlier, based on battles from World War II. But this gives you a good idea of what the area was like. Everything in the darker colors is elevation up to 2,000 and 3,000 meters. This is flatter land, where Firebase Jack previously alluded to, over here, and Camp Evans was flat land. Oh, yes, thank you. And this is actually a photo, amazing photo of Ripcord. Ripcord was about the size of 3 football fields. It had 3 helicopter landing pads. This is a view I've never seen of Ripcord. One thing that was kind of like an identifying marker with Ripcord is impact rock, this huge rock. The rock actually sat over here. This is Bruce up here setting up a mortar. Here's the TOC, Tactical Operations Center. You can see the concertina wire. That goes all the way around the bottom, all the way around. But you can see just how big and how involved this was. Now,
There were like 4 rows cascaded at different levels around Ripcord. They had put, I mean, the top portion of the mountain had, they concertina wire, razor wire, this like yay big round. Sorry, yay big round. And then there's 2 rows on the ground and 1 row on top of it. So if the Vietnamese came in, you know, they had to go through the concertina wire, and you always see the movies in training where the gook that was snuck up there and with a pair of wire cutters, amazing, and cut the wire, and then they go through the wire, and that's not what happened. The first guy in threw a body on top of the concertina wire, and everybody else ran up his back. So that was kind of another real weird thing. But there were, going down the mountain, there were 4 levels of this concertina wire. When you were at the front bunker line, there was a set of 3 rows of concertina wire, and then a little ways up from that was another 3 rows, and a little ways up from that was another 3 rows. Figuring this was going to slow them down as they came running in. There was enough of them they could have walked in holding hands and taken the whole mountain.
Yeah, Bruce, I was just wondering if you could give us your time frame when you were drafted, maybe review that a little bit.
I was drafted February 14th in '68. Am I coming on? Well, that's when I left to go to Detroit for my physical. And I'd been out of high school about a year. 69, I said 68. Yeah. I can't even tell you my age, so numbers and dates, they're kind of screwy. Yeah, right out of high school, I probably had 6, 8 months out of high school. I got my draft notice, got my second draft notice, went down to Fort Wayne in Detroit, which is a nice place to go. Fort Wayne is really beautiful if you get down there. A lot of people don't want to. The induction center's gone. They leveled it. It's a parking lot. And
Okay, that was February '69 then, right?
February '69, yes. And then 8 weeks at basic, another 8 weeks at AIT, 30-day leave, and I was gone, so I got in country in July. I left, I had 2 days left in, I had 2 late days left in country on, and left July 13th. By the time I got home, man, I had a hard time leaving to begin with. You just don't want to leave those guys. We were winning the war in my thoughts when I left, but I got home and I got a letter from, okay, I'm going to lose names, from David McCain. He took over the squad, and 10 days later, the time I got home, there was a letter in the mailbox that they'd been overrun. I didn't bring the letter in. And our guys, my guys had all made it. But they'd been, I think they lost 73 more guys and left 6 guys behind when they were pulling off. I think that's all I got on that one.
Yes, sir.
In the picture from here, the upper left-hand corner is blue. I assume that's sky and not water?
Correct.
You were up so high that you'd get socked in. The clouds would come in, and you could stick your arm out, and it was like you lost your arm. I mean, it was in this cloud. And so, you know, you get socked in quite a bit like that. One day we got socked in, and we hear all this rattling of pots and pans. I mean, it's like a kitchen. You're in the middle of somebody's kitchen. And the clouds suddenly blew away. And here's a Vietnamese company setting up on the hill right over from us. Wide open. Like they didn't notice we were there. Things kind of broke loose on them at that point.
One of the things to follow up on that, several of the guys mentioned how beautiful the area was. And they wanted to make a point of saying that because literally when you fly out over the flatlands and then get into the mountain ranges, you're seeing waterfalls and rivers and creeks and this lush green canopy. And more than a few guys told me this story. And you got your feet hanging out of the Huey and you're flying, and then you go in. And, you know, this peaceful feeling of flying through this wonderful landscape, and then all of a sudden, you're being shot at immediately as soon as you start coming in. And then when you get down, you don't even touch down, and you got a door gunner kicking you out of the door. And it's like, welcome to Vietnam. That was your introduction after search training. You know, a lot of these guys would get right on the choppers and go out, and that's what they saw. And they were blown away with how beautiful it was. And atop that mountain range, that hilltop Ripcord, on a clear day, they could say sometimes you could see out to the South China Sea. On a clear day. It was just beautiful.
In my album, it's just sitting up there. If you like look at, excuse me, my album sitting up there has a picture where you look into Laos. You look into Laos, or you can look the other way into the South China Sea. And it was that high up. And when the door gunners, when as you were saying, when they kicked you out, they said, you know, don't turn around, don't look back. And they were firing. Their 60s were just burning the place up.
Yes, sir.
How many Vietnam vets do we have in the audience? Raise your hand. Okay. Welcome home. I had 2 tours in Vietnam, 66, 67 with the 1st Cav, and 70, 71 with the AmeriCal. Now, the AmeriCal had 20,000 troops, and we were up in I Corps, maybe partly in 2 Corps, but we were up there, Chu Lai, and not very far south of Da Nang. But, you know, the one thing I want to impress upon you, one, we did not lose the war. Congress lost the war because the Vietnamese wanted to fight. I spent a lot of time with the Vietnamese, and they wanted to fight, but Congress cut off complete funding. There were trucks, there were Jeeps, there were equipment sitting beside the road because it didn't have a fuel filter or didn't have something like that. Congress cut off every page to them. But I'll tell you what, though, I live in Benton Harbor. I'm president of Lest We Forget. We do Vietnam and World War II reenactments. But a couple years ago, I was at we had a individual that had a fire base, and it was a maybe 6 foot by 6 foot replica of a fire base, and we got talking about things that went on at fire bases. And guy came up behind us, and I live in Benton Harbor, where Whirlpool headquarters is. And this Oriental individual came up with his son, and he said, "Son, I want you to shake the hands of two men who saved our country." And we shook hands with him, and he explained. He said, in 1960, I lived in Singapore. He said, in 1960, we had no military. We had nothing, and you gave us 16 years to get our military in order. And that, to me, really, really hit home and made me feel that it wasn't a complete waste. And I think that those of us that served over there, we gave the rest of the world, because back in the early 60s, the whole eastern half of the world was going communist. And we gave them time to get their stuff together. So, but a good presentation. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, and I actually don't argue with that basic statement. Congress does lose South Vietnam in the sense that when the Americans finally pulled out, they promised all these things to the South Vietnamese, weapons, supplies, fuel in particular, and didn't deliver any of it, because as we know, a president can say whatever he wants to, but Congress pays the bills. And by then, there were laws against all sorts of stuff, and so the South Vietnamese got nothing. And there's an irony about the end of the war, and that is that now that we've been able to research it and find out the North Vietnamese side of the final days of South Vietnam, it's quite clear that at any number of places as that campaign began, if the South Vietnamese, who by this time had kind of learned how to fight the war, if they had had the right supplies and equipment and fuel, they could have stopped him. And then, and this actually connects back to Ripcord, if they had stopped him there, it would have been very hard for the North Vietnamese to come back again, because in the end, while it didn't seem like it, they would eventually run out of people, not as fast as Robert McNamara wanted, but they were. And Ripcord's significant too. I mean, even if you don't like officers, Ben Harrison, who was a brigade commander at Ripcord, and he's actually on the fire base much of the time while it's being shot at, after the war was over, he eventually got to Vietnam. He went to North Vietnam. He found his counterpart in North Vietnam, the Vietnamese commander on the other side, and actually got to interview him and talk to him. And so he talked about, the battle, sort of how it went and that kind of thing. And Ben asked one last question of him right before the interview ended, and that was, well, what would you have done if we hadn't left? Okay, and this is a fellow who commanded a division of 9 full battalions plus a whole bunch of others. And they had been fighting in that area, and our badly outnumbered guys had been fighting back all this time. Well, the answer was, I still had 1 battalion left. 1 battalion wasn't going to take the fire base. I mean, if we'd had the level of patience to stay, wouldn't have been great for the guys on top of the hill. But eventually the Vietnamese run out. In the end, the Vietnam War was a calculation on their part that we would lose patience before they lost people. And in the end, that's what happened, but it was a nearer run thing than it might have been. One other thing I do want to add here about talking to Ripcord veterans is the number of times that you talk to them and realize those guys were out there and doing their jobs. And you always hear about, there's bad morale and there's slackers and there are all these guys, they're fragging their officers, they're all on drugs, that kind of stuff. And ultimately, no, particularly the guys out there on the front lines, but even the support guys I've talked to, by and large, they went there, they did their jobs, they just wanted to come home in one piece. And by and large, they did their jobs pretty well, and we tend to lose track of that.
To give you an idea about numbers, 68 was the peak number of troops in Vietnam, 540,000. By 69, you're around 450. By 70, you're down to 300,000. That's an incredible drop, an incredible drop. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about what I got to LZ Sharon, which should be on your map there, about 5 miles west of Dong Ha, which was Dong Ha was a Marine base. LZ Sharon was the first well, I was in an artillery unit, which was a bastard artillery unit attached to the 1st Cavalry Division from April 68 till about April of 69. Well, it wasn't quite April, I guess January. But Evans was a 1st Cavalry Division base, and named after, this gentleman might know, it was one of the first Cav guys killed in Vietnam. And then by the time I left, it was Camp Eagle when the 101st moved in and took over. But prior to that, the 1st Cav was primarily responsible for that I Corps Army operations. And the Marines were based out of Da Nang. And of course, our guys were running ammunition into Khe Sanh in April of 68. I just wanted to get the 1st Cav in there.
First Cav. My father was shot at 805, Hill 805, which is just east of Ripcord. And they remember seeing a tree with the 1st Cav insignia carved into it. So yeah.
Let me put a plug in for the 1st Cav. Cav was the only division that fought in all 4 corps. I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps. And that's a thing to remember about the 1st Cav.
I just have one comment for the gentleman from Benton Harbor and the professor. I don't disagree with the fact that funding certainly caused the war to end quicker. But I'm going to tell you, far, far before that, there was things set up for us to lose. I worked in intelligence. I spent my entire time in I Corps, and I drew operational maps for our units and preparing them for battles. And you don't know how many times I wanted to bite my tongue when we drew up no-fire zones. No matter what was happening in certain areas of Vietnam, no matter how many times we got shot at, we were not allowed to return fire to those areas. And that was far, far, far before 1970. Believe me.
I was on Birch's Garden the same time that we had that, when we got that 10-minute delay, and then we got hit. Anyways, it was our first sergeant that he was outside middle of the night, and he was the one that said, the guy came walking up to him and he says, "Who are you?" The guy said, "Quan." And he says, "Oh, no way, there was a guy named Quan in this." So he picked him up and threw him down into that valley you're talking about, along with a hand grenade. And so that's just what I wanted.
Who were you with?
I was with the 101st. First,
The 327th or
no, first 506.
first of the 506?
Yeah, we were on bunker duty when we got hit up there. Yeah, we got hit again too.
Yeah, I was with the second 506. But a lot of the guys up there were the 327th.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we all took turns.
Yeah, so I never, other than our group, which is 3 guys or 5 guys, and then the FDC, the Fire Direction Control, didn't know anybody. So to run into somebody, I've run into one other guy that was on Virtuous Garden. Yeah, and they had that all mapped out. They even had, the outhouse was outside the wire at the top of the mountain. They even had that mapped out. I mean, and when they brought the motors in, they hit, they knew where they wanted them to go. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the term McNamara's morons? 100,000 that were incorporated into the war that were really incompetent. Can you expand on that at all?
Hello. Let's see, this still work? Okay. Yeah. You're talking about Project 100,000. Robert McNamara, the defense secretary for Johnson, at a certain point, and actually this is in part a response to the civil rights movement. There was an observation that large numbers of particularly African Americans, but of various people were being rejected by the military in part because they hadn't passed the aptitude tests. And so the idea was that, well, you could take a group of these people who normally the military did not want, take them in, give them what amounted to remedial education of some kind, and then put them in the military. And they did this, and so later 68, 69, a lot of those guys are showing up. And the impression that I've gotten from people who were there in the units that they joined was that most of them really shouldn't have been in the military at all. And a lot of them had a very hard time adjusting. So, but they were put in with the idea to show that the military wasn't prejudiced, at least that was part of it. And it was not something that did a whole lot for manpower. And in a lot of cases, they might be put in combat units, because that's often where you put the guys who don't get to go into anything else. But they got sent back, because the units in the line didn't want them. Yes? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and now Forrest Gump was a success story, but he's also a fictional character. Yeah. Forrest Gump, movie character. Yeah. It's Tom Hanks, so he had to be good.
Okay. Here's a poem. A young man went off to war in a far country. When he had time, he wrote home and said, "Sure rains here a lot." But his mother, reading between the lines, wrote, quote, "We're quite concerned. Tell us what it's really like." The young man responded, "Wow, you ought to see the funny monkeys." To which his mother replied, "Don't hold back. How is it?" The young man wrote, "The sunsets here are spectacular." In the next letter, the mother wrote, "Son, we want you to tell us everything." So the next time he wrote, "Today I killed a man. Yesterday I helped drop napalm on women and children. Tomorrow we're going to use Agent Orange." And the father wrote, "Son, please don't write such depressing letters. You're upsetting your mother." So after a while, the young man wrote, "Sure rains here a lot." It was his last letter.
The jungle,
Thank you.
the jungle, you weren't just fighting the enemy. You could walk through the jungle and up ahead, it was like it was raining. I mean, this is Triple Kennedy jungle. There's no light coming through, and everything that's on the ground is dead and rotten. I mean, it just reeks. And you're walking along, and it looks like it's raining up ahead, and it's leeches that are falling out of the trees. And I mean, that's when you really know who your buddy was, because they had to look for leeches in places you couldn't see. And I mean, and that was every day. One night we're out on a listening post. There's just two of us, and you spend the night out there together. And you're maybe a couple hundred yards from the nearest friendlies, your company, and you're back to back, and listening, and you don't want to make any kind of sound, but you're back to back, so that if one goes to nod off, the other one feels it. So you can keep make sure someone's awake. You keep each other awake. But we were out there, and it sounds like a herd of elephants coming through, and we didn't know what to do. I mean, we just hunkered down and wished we'd dug a hole a little bit deeper. But it was a herd of monkeys, and I mean, they were just screaming and yelling and tearing things up and scared us to death.
I'd like to make a couple comments. Some of the men here represent a unit called the 3rd Brigade Air Cavalry, and our primary AO was the Ashall Valley and the mountains overlooking the Ashall Valley. There's only a couple of men that were on Ripcord in June and July, running 6-man reconnaissance patrols off of Ripcord. One of them's here, one of them's me, and the pilot that flew for Colonel Harrison was not on the ground in the final days of Ripcord. He was in the air around Ripcord. One of the men in our unit was his door gunner.
Some of the things you've said are sure true. From a different perspective, not so true, because every man had a different experience there. These men, these 3rd Brigade Air Cavalry, we were formed by the brigade commander in September of '69 for primary missions in Northern I Corps. And we worked that area all the way to the DMZ, all the way to the ocean border, all the way to the ocean, all the way down to Hue. And so we knew that AO pretty well. We were just a 30-man unit, but the brigade used us to do specific jobs, helping other units that got hit. We were a heavy weapons reconnaissance platoon is what we were, all volunteer. And most of the men were leaving Vietnam by June. There was only a few men, original men in that unit that were left in July. But Irali was one of the men that was left. And the things that were going on around Ripcord, but you were saying there was only 1 battalion. I got to tell you, I was in those jungles a week before Ripcord fell, and there was a hell of a lot more than any 1 battalion in that area. If America had all the resources that we needed, we may have held Ripcord. But I got to tell you something else, my feelings. You have to remember that North Vietnam was trying to reunite their country. And if there was only 30 men left in North Vietnam, they would have still been in South Vietnam fighting, whether it was Americans or Chinese or French. You got to understand that was their country. Did we help Vietnam? Did we help the Vietnamese people? Well, that's debatable. We sure as hell killed a lot of Vietnamese people. So some people feel like we could have won the war. I tell you, we couldn't have won that war. Not unless we use an atomic bomb like we did in World War II. But it was their country, it was their fight, they'd have fought till the end.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, the Vietnam War was tremendously complicated. In a lot of ways, it really was unwinnable to begin with, because just of the nature of the war, and a lot of it had to do with just the situation there. And we sent in our military to try to go in and do a set of things that may or may not have been possible, and that goes back and forth. And ultimately, we were dealing with an opponent that was totally dedicated to what they were doing on a level that the Americans never really understood. I mean, Lyndon Johnson didn't understand why these people wouldn't make deals. Because, you know, he was used to Texas politics. You make these backroom deals, and I'll give this to you, and you give this to me. And they never would. And he didn't get why. Just wanted to ask a more specific question. You talked about the unit you were in, 3rd Brigade Cavalry. Now, was that the one that would get called the mini-cav? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've interviewed one guy who was in that, and this was a really an unusual unit because they were kind of a built-in fire brigade for this brigade. They would go where they needed to. They could shoot their way in. They could do all kinds of stuff. And they did a good job as far as I can tell. So, of course, they got disbanded. I mean, the last few guys who were there, they got shut down. They weren't allowed to have their own unit to do this, even though there wasn't anybody else who was.
There's about 10 of us that are here out of the original 30 men.
Wish I knew that earlier. But yeah, okay. But they really are a very distinct bunch of people. That's certainly the case. Yeah.
Squad.
Took a group of about 20 of us back to Vietnam 3 years ago, and we started at Hanoi, and then we went out to Ha Long Bay, and then we flew to Hue. We spent about a week up there with the case on, and because these were Marines that were leading the group. We went on all the way down to Saigon, down to Mito. The Vietnamese people loved us. They came, you can't believe how many people came up and talked to us, and they had no love for the Russians. But the thing of it is, even though when we left, the communists took over, and everybody, the rice fields belonged to the community. So nobody worked on Saturday and Sunday. And when we were there, they were out there working in their rice paddies because even though it's a communist country, they've adopted American practices, and the villagers get whatever the profits that the rice paddies accumulate. So, there's a lot of things ideas that were spread by us that are still today out over there. So I'd suggest everybody that are interested, take a trip back and see what's taken place.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for coming out and telling your story, Bruce. Thank you very much for coming. All right. Thank you very much.
I'm Pat Schaefer, and I know it takes a special temperament to be a judge. The decisions a judge makes can seriously alter people's lives. Casting your vote for this position is incredibly important. I've known Jeff Nolan for over 20 years, and I know he will make decisions based on reason and common sense. I know he's the best candidate. Please join me in voting Jeff Nolan for District Court Judge.
I'm Jeffrey Nolan, and I approve this message.
Hello, my name is Joe Bush, and I'm a candidate for Muskegon Probate Court Judge. As a husband and a father, born and raised with strong family values here in Muskegon County, I pledge to work hard for everyone if I'm elected. Probate judges protect individuals and families who are unable to protect themselves. That's why we need a judge with compassion, integrity, and experience. I have over 20 years of trial experience in family and probate courts, nearly 3 times that of my competitor. I've also been endorsed by the entire probate court and 2/3 of the sitting family court right now, and I'm the only candidate endorsed by the judges. And the reason the judges have endorsed me is because they know I have the compassion, integrity, and experience for this important position. All jobs are important. This job requires someone who's qualified. On November 8th, I ask you to turn your ballot over and vote for the most qualified candidate. Vote for Joe Bush. Thank you.
My name is DJ Hilson, your Muskegon County prosecutor. I urge you to vote for Michael Poulin for Muskegon County Sheriff. He has served Muskegon County as professional law enforcement officer for 29 years. Through his training and experience, he has dedicated his career to community-based programs. I am confident that his proven leadership and his dedication to community makes Michael Poulin the most qualified candidate for Muskegon County Sheriff.
I'm Michael Poulin, and I approve of this message.